Welcome to the Pod 20. This week's guest is Dom Joly. You'll know him from Trigger Happy TV, his books including The Dark Tourist and his podcast Earworm. I'm Graham Mack, and you'll know me if you're the driver that delivered our new mop yesterday. This is Podcast Radio's countdown of the top 20 podcasts in the world right now, based on downloads and your recommendations at thepodcastradio.co.uk. Each week I'll be... Dom, is that your phone again?
Hello? Oh, no, I'm on with Graham Mack. No idea, it's rubbish.
Checking in on Zoom, it's Piper Terrett from the Lowdown podcast. Last week we spoke about how I was getting into recording audiobooks, my new gig as an audiobook narrator.
Oh yeah, how's the audiobook going? How far have you got?
Well, I've finished the first one. My biggest worry with the audiobooks is the neighbours at the minute.
Neighbours?
Yeah, because I'm doing them in here, which is the... Actually, this is supposed to be the master bedroom, but when you buy a new flat, you know, a large wardrobe is known as the master bedroom. Behind that wall just there is the neighbour's bedroom.
Ah.
And I'm doing these, you know, that last one I told you about the battle scenes.
Yeah.
You know, come on, you bloody bastards! And I mean, I'm getting right into it. It's bayonets and whatever. But there was an awkward sex scene in a temple.
In a temple?
In a temple, yeah, an Indian temple. And, there's all that. And I have to play both parts. And, like, what they must be thinking. Dom Joly. He was made famous by Trigger Happy TV on Channel 4. After that, Dom, you went to the BBC, but it didn't work out, did it?
I went to the BBC and I started making this show called 100 Things to Do Before You Die. And the idea was, it was like one of those shows, but it was like the wrong person had been given the show. So instead of parachute jumping, I'd lock myself in a fridge and see whether the light went out when the door closed. It was like a weird thing. And we started making it and I was really chuffed with it. It was for BBC Two. And I'd pitched this at Channel 4 before I left and they liked it. All the people at Channel 4 left and went to Channel 5. And I'm halfway through making the show. I opened The Guardian and it said Channel 5 September list, 100 Things to Do Before You Die. And the f***ers had just nicked it totally. And they put it out before mine. So I had to go to BBC Two and say, you know what? They've nicked it and they've done it. So I have to cancel. And we were halfway through the show. And they said, well, just carry on. And I said, no, they've done it already and it's different. Anyway, it was a nightmare. So that got me a reputation at the BBC for being tricky. So I had to sort of stop. And then I launched BBC Three with a fake chat show. And I called it This Is Dom Joly. But I was wearing glasses. And it was so obvious to me that it wasn't me. But everyone, I wanted 20% of people to watch it to think, oh my God, Dom Joly's a and the other 80% to get the joke. As it was, I think 80% of people watched it and went, God, he's a because, I was this sort of ego version of me, and it was clearly faked, but I don't know. But it had a lot of fun. Had lots of bands on it. I love had The Cure on, the Waterboys, Ian Brown. I mean, everyone, Grandaddy. It was fantastic fun. And then I thought I'd better cash in my chips because I knew the BBC were like, what is this guy doing? So I got a show for BBC One. So I made a kind of international Trigger Happy called World Shut Your Mouth, which is still my favourite show. And I kicked off each show. I thought it'd be really funny. I flew around the world in one trip to all the 7 wonders of the world, the Great Wall of China, the pyramids, the Taj Mahal, just to stand in front of it and wait for someone to come up. And I'd go, oh, Taj Mahal. And they'd go, yeah. And I go, well, that is shit. And that was it. That's all I did. And I thought that was the strongest, purest beginning. And honestly, when I handed it into the BBC, I could see them just thinking, this man has to leave the BBC. So that was it.
Your autobiography, Here Comes the Clown, came out in 2015.
Yeah.
But 10 years before that, you did a spoof autobiography called Look at Me. Why did the parody one come first? It would seem like the natural procedure to do a normal one and then parody that.
Because when Trigger Happy was at its height, someone came to me and offered me a stupid amount of money to write my autobiography. And I'd always said, you should never write. I mean, Martine McCutcheon was on her third volumes of her autobiography at the age of about 23. And I was like, you really shouldn't write an autobiography till you're 50, as far as I'm concerned.
I think Britney Spears wrote one before she'd had sex. I mean, how interesting could that have been?
Well, I mean, none of these people write their books anyway, for a start. But anyway, so they offered me a silly amount of money. I couldn't turn it down. And I thought, great, I'll do it. And then the moment I'd accepted, I thought, oh, I can't. I hate these sort of books. So then I thought, I'll do a pastiche. There were a lot of shit autobiographies out at the time. And I thought, I'll write a pastiche one. And then I started writing, and it just segued into this weird thing where it sort of is my life, but it's not really. It's like page 2, I had a talking dog. So it's pretty obviously not my life, but people were like, is this real? But actually it was Lebanon and then a diplomat and stuff. And it went up to the moment I was famous, but in a sort of totally heightened, it was though I was on acid. I've no idea what that book is. I'm quite proud of it actually now, but it was weird. And it absolutely died.
So you didn't murder your Armenian nanny, and you weren't raped by a TV weather girl, and it wasn't covered up?
There are a couple of things in there that did happen. I did end up in a weird flat in Edinburgh with a guy that was a weather reporter and was dancing with his Pekingese. I didn't get raped, obviously, but there are a lot of weird bits in it that are true. There's a Peter Mandelson story in there that's pretty close, and there's weird stuff, yeah.
According to Wikipedia, you went to the same school as Osama Bin Laden. Is that bit true?
That is true, yeah. And that is, I talk about that on my tour that has been rescheduled, but I did a show where I went off. It was called Excellent Adventure, and I was supposed to drive into Syria, where I used to go as a kid from Lebanon. So I flew to Lebanon with a mate, and we were going to go on this road trip into Syria. But the director said, before we go, it'd be nice to see what it was like growing up in Lebanon. Let's go to your old school. So I went to my old school, which is called Brumana High School. And very weird, it's a Quaker school in the mountains above Beirut. And it was built by Quakers from Darlington in 1860. Like, what they were doing there, I have no idea. But anyway, so I went there, and I was filming in the grounds, because I got a fixer, and he'd said, yeah, we sorted it out. And this woman marches out. She's livid, and she's the headmistress. And it turns out the fixer did what I would have done. He just took the money and f***ed off. He didn't ask anyone. So she had no idea what we were doing. So she starts screaming at me, what are you doing here? And I go, I'm really sorry, we're making a documentary. And why? I go, well, because I went to school here. She goes, who gives a shit? So I was like, yeah, fair point. But I was like, to be honest, I think I'm probably one of your more famous alumni. And she looked at me and said, I don't think so. And I go, well, who's more? And she goes, Osama Bin Laden. And I go, okay. So then she panicked because it's a Quaker school. Can you imagine taking prospective parents round and going, Quakers are pacifists, and saying, I don't know if you know about our most famous alumni, Osama Bin Laden. So they then denied it. And I tried to find a school photo of me and Bin Laden because he was 16 and I was 6. And this was 1974. So we were there together for a year. But obviously, I didn't know him. I didn't meet him. He didn't look like that at the time. The Bin Ladens looked like the Partridge Family back then. So, but yeah, I did.
Right. So it's a shame you didn't get to know him, because you could have maybe convinced him, his life could have gone a different way. It's like these people who say they had a time machine, they'd go back and kill baby Hitler, or at least go back and tell him that his art was pretty good. It could have changed the world. Yeah. So Or
maybe I'd have joined Al-Qaeda. Who knows?
You could have gone the other way. Yes, it could. It could have done.
It's not good for me when I go to the States, though, because they look at my passport, born in Beirut. Then they look it up online. It says trigger happy, comedy terrorist, went to school with Bin Laden. I've got visas from Iran, North Korea, Congo. It's not a pleasant thing when I go to America.
Yeah, especially in an airport if you tell them you're there to shoot a pilot. Yeah.
Yeah. Very good.
I want to give a nod to the journalist Piper Terrett. She's got a podcast out called The Lowdown.
Have you had anything embarrassing happen during lockdown?
Embarrassing? No. I got some news this week that can only be described as a roller coaster of emotion.
Oh, no.
There is a fine line between comedy and tragedy, and my family in Liverpool straddle that line quite regularly. To give you a bit of background, currently I'm, shall we say, disconnected from my close family. My sister hates me, and in my mother's eyes, my sister can do no wrong, so
that's horrible.
We have nothing to do with each other, because any time I've gone up there to have any time with either of them. I've ended up getting quite hurt, actually. So I'm not disconnected, to punish them or hurt them. I'm disconnected just to protect me because it's not pleasant. Now, my dad died in June last year. He was cremated, and I didn't go to the funeral because I knew my sister was going to be there, and I didn't want anything to kick off because all the extended family would have been there. And there's really no words to describe the intensity of the hatred that my sister has for me, and I didn't want that to be the focus of the funeral.
Yeah.
My dad and I didn't have what you would call a father-son relationship.
Oh.
I never actually got the feeling that he even liked me, but that's a different thing.
Yeah.
I never found him to be a particular role model. He was such a cheapskate.
Really?
Yeah. We weren't poor, but he would not spend money. Like, well, something as basic as school shoes. Most kids had school shoes.
Yeah.
I had steel toe-capped work boots because he used to steal them from the site he worked on, and that's what I went to school in.
Oh, God.
I know.
That's awful.
Yeah. Anyway, I mean, he would know the price of the pint at every pub within a 10-mile radius, and how much cheaper it was in the club that he went to,
Yeah.
For my 40th birthday, we were living in Bournemouth at the time, and they came down to visit, and we went out for lunch at Frankie and Benny's, and he wouldn't order any food because the deal they were on in their hotel, they got a meal.
Okay.
So,
Yeah.
So anyway, but my extended family are lovely. Mm. And I've never felt anything other than love and support, and they're wonderful. Mm. And this week, I got an email from my favourite auntie, my mum's sister, my Auntie Hazel in Liverpool. She emailed me to say that her brother, my Uncle Brian in Scotland, had died.
Oh, no.
And I was really quite upset when I found out, because I really, really liked Uncle Brian.
Yeah.
I mean, he really was someone, I mean, he was an ex-Navy man. He was, generous, and I can remember playing football. He'd come down from Scotland every now and again. It was a real treat when he'd show, I can remember playing football in the back garden with him when I was about 5. And it's funny, I have no memory of playing football in the back garden with my father.
No.
But Uncle Brian died, and there were tears and all the rest of it. And it was good because I realised that, I always wonder whether I'm normal. I think that's the number one question a lot of people ask themselves is, am I normal?
Yeah.
When I found out that my dad had died, once again, it was also my Auntie Hazel that told me that my dad had died last June, I felt nothing. Like nothing. Not anger or release or sadness or happiness. There was nothing. And at the time I was like, wow, there's something wrong with me. Your father dies. You're supposed to feel something. Really worried. Mm. And I Googled it, and I found that kids who didn't have a proper relationship with their father, but always wanted one, you desperately want love and approval from your father, especially a boy.
Of course you do. Yeah.
It turns out that you've actually been mourning them your whole life. So when the moment comes that they die, you've done it. You've been through it.
Yeah.
And I spoke to Dom Joly about it on the podcast radio interview I did, and he had a similar thing. He said that he'd mourned him for 10 years before. I think I'd mourned my dad for a lot longer than that. So that made me feel okay. And then when I realised I was upset about Uncle Brian going, that, I'm normal, So that was a bit of relief there that, I'm not a Vulcan, there's... So anyway,
none of us are normal, Graham. This is the
nobody's
thing.
normal.
Nobody's normal. No,
so
it's no such thing.
So nobody's normal. It forced me to reply to my Auntie Hazel to thank her for telling me and to let her know that the message, I'd got the message. And I wrote some nice things about my Uncle Brian. When I was a kid, I was into space, and I remember he took me to Jodrell Bank to see the radio telescope. And a funny story is he lived on the island of Rothsay in Scotland, the Isle of Bute. Rothsay, Isle of Bute in Scotland, and he used to run a cafe on the front there. Everybody in the town knew him, and we were out. It was day out. There's a main ferry, the Weems Bay ferry, but there's another ferry way out on the arse end of the island, I suppose. And it's very rural at this other ferry. And we were there. I think we'd only gone there just to see the ferry. We weren't getting on it. We'd come across on it. Anyway, so we're waiting there, and it's a rural Scottish island.
Yeah.
And there's a bloke rides up on a horse. I mean, this huge, beautiful brown horse. And I don't know, it was probably going on the ferry, the horse. I don't know.
Yeah.
Bloke rides up on a horse. And I'm standing there with Brian, and this other bloke starts walking towards us. And Brian says to me, he says, this boy here, he's a really, really, really nice man. He said, but he's a bit simple. He's touched, but he's a lovely fella. But I just thought I'd let you know. And I'm okay. And I'm like, 12 years old at this, but he's letting me in. This bloke comes up and he says, "Hi, Brian, how you doing? You all right?" And then he's like, "Oh, yeah, fine. He says, "That's a fine-looking horse, that there. That's a beautiful horse. What breed of horse would that be, Brian?" And without trying to be funny, with a total straight face, he turns to him and he goes, "I think that would be that's your red setter." And this fella goes, "A red setter, is that a fact? Aye, well, it's a fine-looking red setter, so it is." And I always wondered whether this fella had, later that day had been in his local pub or something, and he'd be talking to people, and they know he's a bit that way.
Yeah. And
he would have said, "Oh, I was at the ferry today, and a bloke rode by on a red setter." but anyway, that was Brian. Now I've opened a dialogue with my Auntie Hazel, my mum's sister, and Brian was her brother, so I've opened this dialogue. She replied to my email with some details of what's been going on with my mum and my sister, because, I'm disconnected from them.
Yeah.
And this sentence in particular jumped out. She says, "Your dad is still on the shelf at the undertaker's because no one has paid the bill for the funeral."
What?
Like I said, fine line between tragedy and comedy.
Yes.
Now, my first thoughts were, oh, for goodness sake, between my mum and my sister, you had the funeral, he's been cremated, for goodness sake, pay the bloody bill, right?
Yes.
My first emotion was, for goodness sake.
Yes.
Frustration.
Yeah.
He died it's nearly a year.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes. Oh dear.
This was last night I got this. So it was, I go to bed and Julie said, I said, "You won't believe this." And Julie put it into perspective perfectly. She said, "Well, it's what he would have wanted. He would have been so proud because he was such a cheap bugger to think that he got a free funeral at the very end. Like these people who are always late, and you say, I bet they'll be late for their own funeral."
Yeah.
He was always cheap, and I bet he ended up having a funeral that doesn't get... He actually wouldn't care that he's on the shelf, and he'd be more bothered that somebody paid for it.
A fitting tribute, I suppose.
A fitting tribute to a cheap man. Yes. Yeah.
Yes. Oh dear. Yeah.
Yeah. So, like I say, roller coaster of emotions there. Yeah.
Certainly sounds like it. Yeah. Yeah.